Some movies fail loudly, others fail quietly, and a few fail so completely that history has to circle back decades later to admit the mistake. In the 1960s, studios chased prestige while audiences chased comfort, and anything too strange, too bleak, or too honest was left behind. These films were rejected, ridiculed, or ignored. Today, they're worshipped. This is the story of cinema's most misunderstood survivors. Number 17. Performance, 1970. Few films ended the 1960s in such spectacular confusion. Performance was meant to be a gritty crime thriller starring rock royalty and hardened gangsters. What it became was something far more dangerous, an identity-shattering fever dream that studios had no idea how to sell. MGM panicked almost immediately. Early cuts terrified executives. Scenes blurred sexuality, violence, gender and ego in ways mainstream cinema had never dared. The studio delayed the release, re-edited the film without consent, and quietly hoped it would disappear. Audiences were baffled, critics were divided, the box office was a disaster. But here's what time revealed. Performance wasn't broken. It was prophetic. The film's fractured editing mirrors its themes of psychological collapse. Its use of music, hallucination, and mirrored identities would later influence everything from art house cinema to music videos. What once felt incoherent now feels intentional. What once felt indulgent now feels fearless. This is a film about losing the self, and that made it impossible for a culture still clinging to clear heroes and villains. Today, it stands as one of the boldest transitional works ever made, already bridging the optimism of the 60s with the paranoia of the 70s. Performance didn't just flop, it frightened the people who financed it, and that fear is exactly why it endured. Number 16. Zabriskie Point, 1970. When Zabriskie Point opened, it was declared dead on arrival. Critics mocked it. Audiences stayed away. Studio executives wrote it off as self-indulgent nonsense. For years, it was held up as proof that Hollywood should never trust counterculture filmmakers again. And yet, this failure refuses to die. Michelangelo Antonioni wasn't trying to tell a traditional story. He was capturing a mood, alienation, rage, disconnection, the feeling that America itself had become an emotional desert. The film's sparse dialogue and drifting structure were intentional. They were a rejection of comfort. At the time, that rejection was unforgivable, but what was once labeled empty is now seen as hypnotic. The infamous desert sequences, once ridiculed, are now studied for their visual power. The explosive finale, both literal and symbolic, has become one of the most iconic acts of cinematic rebellion ever filmed. Zabriskie Point failed because it refused to entertain. It demanded reflection instead. And decades later, in an era defined by disillusionment, its message finally found an audience. This isn't a movie you watch, it's a movie you drift through, and that slow burn is exactly why it became immortal. Number 15. Barbarella, 1968. Barbarella was supposed to be a spectacle, a glossy sci-fi adventure that would ride the wave of space-age optimism and psychedelic style. Instead, it was laughed at, misunderstood, and dismissed as campy nonsense. Audiences didn't know what to do with it. Was it parody? Was it erotica? Was it satire? The film refused to clarify, and that confusion killed it at the box office. But culture changed. What once seemed ridiculous began to feel deliberate. The exaggerated sets, the outrageous costumes, the unapologetic sexuality. Barbarella wasn't failing at seriousness. It was mocking it. Long before camp became fashionable, this film embraced excess as identity. Over time, viewers stopped asking what Barbarella was supposed to be and started appreciating what it actually was, a playful rejection of masculine sci-fi seriousness, led by a heroine who controlled her own pleasure and destiny. Today, Barbarella is celebrated not despite its absurdity, but because of it. It predicted the rise of stylized genre cinema that values attitude as much as narrative. This film didn't age poorly. The world finally caught up to its joke. Number 14. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. When Night of the Living Dead first crept into theaters, no one involved imagined it would change cinema forever. In fact, its initial release was mishandled so badly that it barely stood a chance. There was no major studio backing, no real marketing push. Worse still, a copyright error meant the film slipped instantly into the public domain, robbing its creators of profits and prestige. At the time, it didn't look like a classic. It looked like a low-budget shocker dumped into grindhouses and late-night slots. Audiences were stunned, not entertained. This was not the safe monster horror of the past. There was no gothic romance, no reassuring hero. The violence was raw, the tone was merciless. Children watched it at matinees and left traumatized. Critics were appalled. Some newspapers openly questioned whether such a film should exist at all. And that reaction is exactly why it mattered. What viewers were responding to wasn't just zombies, it was the collapse of order. The film stripped away every comforting illusion audiences expected. Authority figures failed. Families turned on each other. Survival became ugly and cruel. Even the ending offered no catharsis, only bleak finality. Commercially, it struggled at first. It played, it shocked, and then it vanished into obscurity. But because it circulated freely, it spread. College campuses, midnight screenings, counterculture audiences who recognized its deeper meaning. Over time, and people realized this wasn't exploitation, it was a mirror. Night of the Living Dead became a cult classic because it spoke a truth no one wanted to hear in 1968. That society is fragile, that violence isn't heroic, that survival doesn't guarantee justice. Today, it is impossible to imagine modern horror without it. The film didn't just revive the zombie genre, it weaponized it. And the reason it failed at first is the same reason it endures. It refused to comfort anyone. Number 13, Head, 1968. Head arrived with every possible advantage, and still collapsed instantly. It starred one of the most famous pop groups on the planet. It was financed by a major studio. It was released at the height of youth culture, and audiences hated it. The problem was expectation. Fans wanted a harmless musical comedy. What they got was a savage, surreal dismantling of fame, television, war, capitalism, and identity itself. The film refused narrative logic. Scenes smashed into each other without explanation. Jokes turned bitter. Musical numbers collapsed into chaos. Nothing reassured the viewer. Critics didn't know how to process it. Fans felt betrayed. The box office cratered. Overnight, Head was declared a disaster, and it nearly ended the careers of everyone involved. But history would flip that verdict completely. What looked like self-destruction was actually self-awareness. Head wasn't mocking its audience, it was warning them. The film openly attacked the artificial nature of celebrity culture and the machinery behind manufactured youth entertainment. It predicted the burnout of pop idols before it became routine. At the time, that honesty was unforgivable. Years later, underground audiences rediscovered the film. Without the pressure of expectation, its brilliance became obvious. The fragmented structure wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. The humor wasn't random, it was corrosive. The film captured the moment when the 1960s dream began eating itself alive. Head became a cult classic because it tells the truth too early. It shows what happens when innocence is commodified and rebellion becomes a product. That message didn't resonate in 1968. It resonates perfectly now. This film didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it refused to lie. And cult cinema has always belonged to the films that told the truth first, and paid the price for it. Number 12, The Graduate, 1967. It's easy to forget that The Graduate was not universally embraced when it first arrived. Today, it's treated like an untouchable classic. But in 1967, its tone unsettled as many viewers as it captivated. Audiences weren't sure whether they were supposed to laugh, sympathize, or recoil. Critics were split. Older viewers were openly uncomfortable. The film didn't fail in the traditional box office sense, but it failed culturally before it succeeded. It was accused of being immoral, cynical, even nihilistic. For a generation raised on clean moral arcs and clear resolutions, The Graduate felt like an accusation rather than entertainment. That discomfort mattered. Instead of celebrating ambition or romance, the film fixated on paralysis. Its hero wasn't brave or decisive. He was lost, passive, emotionally adrift. If the adults weren't wise guides, they were suffocating figures clinging to empty success. The famous imagery of being trapped behind glass wasn't subtle. It was suffocating by design. Many early viewers missed the point. They expected rebellion to look heroic. The Graduate showed it as awkward, selfish, and deeply uncertain. That honesty didn't sit well in a culture still pretending that the American dream was intact. Over time, perception shifted. Younger audiences recognized themselves in the confusion. The film's humor grew darker. Its ending, once celebrated as romantic, was reinterpreted as bleak and unresolved. That final smile fading into doubt became one of the most haunting images of the era. The Graduate earned its cult status not because it was comfortable, but because it aged honestly. And each generation sees something more unsettling in it. What once felt funny now feels tragic. What once felt rebellious now feels trapped. This is a film that didn't just depict generational anxiety, it embalmed it. And that lingering unease is exactly why it never stopped resonating. Number 11. The Trip, 1967. When The Trip premiered, it was immediately condemned. Critics dismissed it as irresponsible. Moral watchdogs attacked it as propaganda. The studio barely knew how to defend it. A film that openly depicted an LSD experience, without punishment or condemnation, was simply unacceptable in 1967. Commercially, it struggled. The backlash overshadowed everything else. Many theaters refused to play it. Others marketed it as a warning rather than a movie. Mainstream audiences stayed away. But underground audiences leaned in. The Trip wasn't interested in preaching. It was interested in immersion. The film didn't explain the psychedelic experience. It attempted to replicate it. Fragmented visuals, disjointed dialogue, sudden shifts in tone, reality bending without warning. For viewers expecting a conventional narrative, it felt incoherent. For others, it felt eerily accurate. That accuracy scared people. At the time, America was desperate to control the narrative around counterculture experimentation. The Trip refused to cooperate. It neither glamorized nor demonized the experience. It simply presented it. That neutrality made it dangerous. Over the years, its reputation transformed completely. Film scholars began reevaluating its visual language. Experimental filmmakers cited it as an influence. Its sensory editing and non-linear structure were recognized as groundbreaking rather than sloppy. The movie also became an artifact, a preserved snapshot of a moment when cinema briefly tried to understand altered consciousness instead of fearing it. What once looked like chaos now looks intentional. What once felt indulgent now feels historically essential. The Trip didn't fail because it was empty. It failed because it arrived too early, when curiosity itself was seen as a threat. Its cult legacy exists because time eventually allowed audiences to meet it on its own terms. Not as a warning, not as propaganda, but as an experience. Number 10. Point Blank, 1967. When Point Blank hit theaters in 1967, audiences didn't just dislike it. They didn't understand it. This was supposed to be a straightforward crime thriller. A tough guy, a revenge plot, a clear path from betrayal to payoff. Instead, viewers were confronted with fractured time, emotional detachment, and a protagonist who felt more like a ghost than a hero. The reaction was immediate confusion. Critics complained that the film was cold. Audiences said it was empty. Studio executives quietly admitted they had no idea how to market it. The box office reflected that uncertainty. Point Blank didn't connect, and it quickly faded from mainstream conversation. But the failure wasn't in execution. It was in expectation. This film dismantles the revenge genre from the inside. Its hero isn't driven by passion. He's driven by absence. Money becomes meaningless. Violence brings no relief. Time itself feels unreliable. Scenes bleed into each other as if memory and reality are indistinguishable. In 1967, and that approach felt alienating. Today, it feels revolutionary. What once seemed emotionally distant is now understood as intentional minimalism. The film strips away sentimentality to expose the hollowness at the center of obsession. Revenge doesn't heal. It doesn't restore identity. It only prolongs emptiness. As years passed, filmmakers began citing Point Blank as a blueprint. Its editing style influenced modern thrillers. Its visual language reshaped neo-noir. Its refusal to explain everything became a strength rather than a flaw. The cult following didn't emerge overnight. It grew slowly, through film schools, repertory screenings, and late-night broadcasts where viewers finally had the space to absorb its rhythm. Point Blank failed because it rejected emotional payoff at a time when audiences demanded it. Its legacy exists because later generations recognized that denial as honesty. This isn't a revenge story. It's a post-revenge autopsy, and cinema would spend decades catching up to that idea. Number 9. Blowup, 1966. Blowup arrived wrapped in prestige, but its reception was anything but secure. Critics admired its craft, yet questioned its purpose. Audiences were frustrated by its refusal to explain itself. Studio expectations of a clear mystery collided with a film that deliberately erased certainty. Commercially, it underperformed relative to expectations. Culturally, it unsettled almost everyone who watched it. At its core, Blowup denies resolution. A potential murder is discovered, then questioned, then possibly erased. Evidence dissolves, truth becomes subjective. The camera, all once trusted as an objective witness, becomes unreliable. In the 1960s, that was deeply uncomfortable. Audiences wanted answers. Blowup offered ambiguity. They wanted revelation. The film offered silence. Even its ending, a literal imaginary tennis match, felt like provocation rather than closure. For years, the movie was dismissed as pretentious art house indulgence. Then time did what the film itself predicted. As media saturation increased and reality became more manipulable, Blowup began to feel prophetic. The idea that images could lie, that proof could vanish, that perception shapes truth, no longer felt abstract. It felt accurate. Film scholars reevaluated its structure. What once seemed evasive was understood as philosophical. The mystery wasn't about solving a crime. It was about realizing that certainty itself might be an illusion. The film's cult status grew among viewers drawn to unresolved narratives and existential dread. It became a cornerstone of cinema that questions reality rather than confirms it. Blowup didn't fail because it lacked answers. It failed because it suggested answers might not exist. In a decade obsessed with clarity and rebellion narratives, that suggestion felt intolerable. Today, it feels essential. This is a film that doesn't reveal the truth. It exposes the lie that truth is ever fixed, and that quiet provocation is exactly why it endured. Number 8. Seconds 1966. When Seconds premiered in 1966, audiences didn't just reject it, they recoiled from it. Marketed as a science fiction thriller with a major star, the film arrived with expectations of intrigue, excitement, and escapism. What viewers received instead was something far more unsettling, a cold existential nightmare that stripped away the fantasy of reinvention and replaced it with dread. People walked out confused and disturbed. Critics struggled to categorize it. Box office returns were weak, and the film was quickly labeled a failure. In a decade obsessed with optimism and transformation, Seconds felt like an accusation aimed directly at the audience. The premise alone was uncomfortable. A middle-aged man is offered a chance at a new body, a new life, and a clean break from his past. On paper, it sounds like wish fulfillment, but the film refuses that fantasy at every turn. The transformation is clinical and dehumanizing. The new life feels hollow and artificial. Freedom becomes alienation. Pleasure becomes obligation. The camera itself seems hostile. It's using distorted lenses and oppressive compositions that trap the viewer inside the character's anxiety. Nothing is reassuring, nothing is celebratory. Reinvention, the film suggests, doesn't erase emptiness. It amplifies it. That message was poison in 1966. Audiences wanted progress stories. They wanted the future to feel bright. Seconds instead whispered that identity cannot be escaped, and that the pursuit of perfection leads not to liberation, but to annihilation. Its infamous ending offered no comfort, no lesson neatly wrapped in hope, just finality. That bleakness destroyed its initial reputation. But time transformed the verdict. As decades passed, viewers began to see how far ahead of its time the film really was. In an era obsessed with cosmetic surgery, manufactured lifestyles, and curated identities, Seconds now feels prophetic. Its themes resonate more powerfully than ever. What once seemed nihilistic now feels honest. What once seemed cruel now feels necessary. The film didn't fail because it was poorly made. It failed because it told a truth audiences weren't ready to hear. Today it stands as one of the most chilling cult classics of the 1960s, a warning disguised as science fiction, finally understood on its own terms. Number 7. The Wild Angels, 1966. The Wild Angels was dismissed almost instantly upon release, written off as crude exploitation designed to shock rather than say anything meaningful. Critics attacked its nihilism. Moral commentators condemned its violence and chaos. Even some audiences who came for rebellion left unsettled by what they saw. There was no heroic arc, no redemption, no moral anchor. As a commercial product, the film struggled to find respectability, and its reputation was quickly reduced to that of a loud, tasteless biker movie meant to be forgotten. But that dismissal missed the point entirely. What the Wild Angels captured, almost accidentally, was the spiritual rot beneath the fantasy of rebellion. Unlike later films that romanticized outlaw culture, this one refuses to clean it up. Its characters aren't misunderstood freedom fighters. They're destructive, selfish, and emotionally empty. Their violence isn't stylized. It's ugly and pointless. Their rituals feel hollow. Their sense of brotherhood collapses under the weight of ego and chaos. The infamous funeral sequence, often cited as shocking exploitation, isn't included for thrill. It's there to show how even grief has been stripped of meaning. In 1966, that honesty was unacceptable. Youth culture was still being mythologized. and rebellion was being packaged as something noble. The Wild Angels shattered that illusion. It showed rebellion without purpose, freedom without direction, a generation burning energy with nowhere to go. That realism made audiences uncomfortable, and the film paid the price. Years later, cult audiences began to reevaluate it. Seen through historical distance, the film became a time capsule of disillusionment rather than a celebration of chaos. Its rawness, once criticized, became its strength. Its lack of moral reassurance became its thesis. Filmmakers and critics began recognizing it as an early warning signal, one that predicted how quickly counterculture ideals could curdle into nihilism. The Wild Angels didn't become a cult classic because it was misunderstood. Nay, it became one because it understood its moment too well. It refused to glorify destruction. It simply showed it. And that refusal made it one of the most brutally honest films of the decade, finally appreciated by audiences willing to confront what rebellion actually looked like when the cameras stopped flattering it. Number 6. The Loved One, 1965. When The Loved One premiered in 1965, it didn't just confuse audiences, it alienated them. Marketed as a dark comedy, the film arrived with a tone so corrosive and a worldview so merciless that mainstream viewers had no reference point for how to receive it. Death wasn't treated with reverence. Grief wasn't treated with sincerity. American institutions weren't gently mocked, they were vivisected. The result was a film that critics called cruel, audiences called tasteless, and studios quietly wished they had never financed. Box office returns reflected that rejection. The Loved One was written off as a failure almost immediately. What made the film so toxic in 1965 was its total lack of emotional compromise. This wasn't satire designed to reassure viewers that society was flawed but fixable. It was satire that suggested the rot was systemic. The funeral industry becomes a grotesque machine driven by profit and vanity. Characters speak in empty slogans. Compassion is performative. Even love itself feels transactional. Every familiar ritual surrounding death is stripped of meaning and exposed as marketing. For audiences still clinging to post-war ideals of dignity and progress, the film felt like an insult. But time did what it always does with honest cruelty. It sharpened its relevance. As decades passed, as viewers began to recognize how accurately The Loved One predicted the commodification of grief, the corporate packaging of intimacy, and the hollow language of professionalism. What once felt exaggerated now feels eerily familiar. The film's humor, once dismissed as mean-spirited, is now understood as surgical. It doesn't exaggerate reality, it reveals it. Cult audiences gravitated toward the film precisely because it refuses comfort. There is no moral release, no sentimental counterbalance. The laughter it provokes is nervous, uneasy, and often delayed. That delayed recognition is where its power lives. You don't leave The Loved One feeling entertained. You leave it feeling exposed. The film failed in 1965 because it attacked sacred ground without apology. It mocked not just systems, but the emotional language people used to protect themselves from mortality. That level of honesty was unacceptable then. Today, it feels necessary. The Loved One didn't become a cult classic because tastes softened. It became one because reality hardened and finally caught up with its bleak, brilliant joke. Number 5. Faster, Pussycat. Kill, kill, 1965. Faster, Pussycat. Kill, kill was dead on arrival. Audiences stayed away. Critics dismissed it as vulgar exploitation. The box office barely registered. At the time, it looked like a cheap, tasteless detour, loud, aggressive, and fundamentally unserious. No one involved imagined it would survive beyond its initial failure, let alone become one of the most celebrated cult films of the decade. The reason it collapsed in 1965 is simple. It was too confrontational. This was a film that refused to present women as passive objects or moral symbols. Its female characters weren't nurturing. They weren't redemptive. They were violent, sexual, dominant, and unapologetically cruel. For mainstream audiences conditioned to see power as masculine, that reversal felt threatening rather than exciting. The film didn't ask permission. It didn't soften its edges. It leaned into excess and dared viewers to look away. At the time, that defiance was misread as incompetence. But underground audiences began to see something else entirely. Beneath the exaggerated performances and stark visuals was a radical reconfiguration of gender dynamics. The men in the film are weak, greedy, or disposable. Authority is meaningless. Power belongs to those willing to seize it without justification. That wasn't just exploitation, it was subversion. As feminist film criticism emerged, Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill was reevaluated completely. What once seemed crude was recognized as confrontational. What once seemed tasteless was understood as deliberate provocation. The film's stylized violence and heightened performances became part of its language rather than its limitation. Its cult status grew through midnight screenings, repertory cinemas, and word of mouth among audiences hungry for cinema that broke rules without apology. Over time, the film stopped being laughed at and started being studied. Its influence spread far beyond its budget, shaping attitudes toward genre cinema and female power on screen. Faster, Pussycat! Kill! Kill! Failed because it refused to flatter its audience. It didn't reassure viewers that rebellion was safe or that power would return to familiar hands. It suggested something far more unsettling, that dominance is arbitrary, desire is dangerous, and morality is optional. That message was unacceptable in 1965. It's irresistible now. Number 4. Carnival of Souls, 1962. When Carnival of Souls was released in 1962, it barely registered. There was no major studio push, no recognizable stars, and no clear genre label that theaters knew how to sell. It drifted into drive-ins and second-run houses, confused audiences, and quietly disappeared. At the time, it looked like a cheaply made horror oddity, slow, oddly paced, and emotionally distant. Compared to the polished studio thrillers of the era, it felt unfinished and strange. That strangeness was the problem. And it was also the point. The film isn't interested in jump scares or spectacle. It's about alienation. Its horror comes from silence, repetition, and the unnerving sense that the world itself has gone wrong. The protagonist moves through familiar spaces that no longer respond to her. People ignore her. Music swells at inappropriate moments. Reality feels slightly out of sync. In 1962, audiences expected horror to be external and confrontable. Carnival of Souls made it internal and inescapable. Because it lacked commercial success, the film survived mostly through television broadcasts and late-night programming. That accidental exposure changed everything. Viewers encountering it alone, half asleep, found its dreamlike tone deeply unsettling. Over time, it gained a following among horror fans who recognized its existential dread as something far more potent than monsters or violence. Today, Carnival of Souls is regarded as a foundational cult classic, influencing generations of filmmakers who realized that fear doesn't need explanation, it needs atmosphere. The film failed because it whispered when audiences wanted to be shouted at. It endured because whispers linger longer than screams. Number 3. The Collector, 1965. The Collector arrived in 1965 with respectable credentials and serious intent, yet it struggled to connect with mainstream audiences. It wasn't a conventional thriller. There was no heroic rescue, no comforting moral framework. Viewers expecting suspenseful entertainment instead found themselves trapped inside a cold, but claustrophobic psychological experiment. The box office response was muted, and discussion around the film quickly faded. What unsettled audiences was its refusal to guide their emotions. The film centers on obsession stripped of romance. The antagonist isn't charismatic or monstrous. He's painfully ordinary. His violence isn't explosive. It's methodical, quiet, bureaucratic. That realism made the story far more disturbing than audiences were prepared for. There was no catharsis in watching evil exposed. There was only discomfort in watching it persist. In the mid-1960s, thrillers still relied on moral clarity. The Collector denied that clarity completely. It presented cruelty without spectacle and suffering without melodrama. Viewers were left alone with the implications, and many rejected the experience outright. Over time, however, that emotional austerity became its defining strength. As cinema moved toward darker psychological territory, the film was rediscovered and reappraised. Its minimalism began to feel intentional rather than empty. Its restraint began to feel mature rather than dull. The film's influence can be seen in later psychological horror that emphasizes control, surveillance, and emotional imprisonment over physical violence. The Collector became a cult classic because it treats fear as a slow erosion rather than a shock. It doesn't entertain comfort, it observes behavior. That approach alienated audiences in 1965. Today, it feels disturbingly modern. Number 2. Easy Rider, 1969. It feels almost heretical to call Easy Rider a failure, given how deeply it's embedded in film history. But its journey to cult status was anything but smooth. When the film first emerged, many critics dismissed it as shapeless, indulgent, and technically sloppy. Studio executives didn't understand it. Traditional audiences didn't trust it. Even those who sensed its cultural relevance weren't convinced it worked as a movie. It looked cheap, it sounded rough, it refused to explain itself. That rejection mattered. Easy Rider wasn't built like classical cinema. It wandered, conversations drifted, characters didn't grow so much as dissolve. The film wasn't interested in heroes or victory. It was interested in mood, disillusionment, and the quiet collapse of the American promise. For audiences trained to expect structure and moral clarity, that looseness felt like incompetence rather than intent. What truly unsettled viewers, however, and was its ending. There was no triumph, no escape, just sudden, meaningless violence. The road didn't lead to freedom, it led to a dead end. In 1969, that felt like betrayal. The counterculture was supposed to represent hope. Easy Rider suggested it represented vulnerability instead. Over time, that honesty became its defining strength. The film captured the precise moment when idealism gave way to paranoia. Its rough edges stopped looking amateurish and started looking authentic. Its refusal to comfort audiences became its thesis. The cult following grew as generations revisited it, not as a celebration of freedom, but as a warning about how fragile that freedom really was. Easy Rider became a cult classic not because it offered answers, but because it preserved a question the culture tried to forget. What happens when the dream runs out of road? Number 1. Peeping Tom, 1960. No film on this list was punished more brutally for its honesty than Peeping Tom. When it premiered in 1960, the backlash was immediate and vicious. Critics condemned it as perverse. The public rejected it outright. The outrage was so severe that it effectively ended its director's career. The film wasn't just a flop. It was treated as a moral offense. What made Peeping Tom intolerable was not its violence, but its implication. It forced audiences to confront their own role as voyeurs. The killer's obsession with filming fear was a mirror held up to the act of watching itself. This wasn't a monster attacking from the shadows. It was cinema implicating the viewer. And in an era that still separated entertainment from introspection, that accusation was unforgivable. The film vanished almost overnight, buried under scandal and shame. For years, it was spoken of in hushed tones, if at all. But time, again, shifted the verdict. As film theory evolved, Peeping Tom was rediscovered and re-examined. What once seemed sick was recognized as psychologically precise. What once felt exploitative was understood as self-aware. The film wasn't celebrating violence, it was dissecting it. Its focus on fear, control, and spectatorship anticipated decades of psychological horror to come. Today, Peeping Tom is widely regarded as one of the most important cult films ever made. It didn't fail because it lacked craft. It failed because it saw the future too clearly. Rather, it exposed the uncomfortable truth that cinema itself feeds on looking, and sometimes on cruelty. This is the ultimate cult classic of the 1960s. Not because it was rediscovered, but because it survived being condemned for telling the truth first. These films weren't rescued by luck. They survived because they refused to bend. Rejected for being too honest, too strange, or too early, they waited for audiences willing to listen. Cult cinema isn't about rediscovery. It's about recognition. When the world finally catches up to the truth these movies already knew.